So what we're doing is we're continuing the hard-coded censorship in open source Mastodon clients. How free is open source? That's the question, isn't it? I mean, the question is not... the title is not really the best. Well, I guess, yeah, this is. Open source is such a big thing. Where were we? I don't remember. So, right, the summary of the thing is that there is this... Mastodon is like a decentralized open source Twitter thing. That there can be many clients or connections to. Similar to, like, Twitter is centralized and you only have that one place. Nodon was saying yesterday, right? You can compare it to emails. You can send emails between Google Mail and Hotmail, for example. That just works fine. So Mastodon is like that you can have two different clients that connect to Mastodon and send Mastodon messages. And a lot of these are blocking, right? They're hard blocking URLs. And that's possible, right? You can, let's say it's completely doable. If Google wanted to, they could block all mails from Hotmail. They could do that. That is something that they've done with the Twitter thing. And they've banned a place called the Gab because they, like a lot of places ban the Gab because that's where Gab is typically where banned Twitter users end up. And they consider the Gab to be fascist. Yeah, they consider the Gab to be fascist. That's what they said anyway. And they banned like in the source code from the thing, and the discussion then becomes because at the moment the open source licenses like the GPL specifically does not hinder them from doing this, banning whoever they want. But the author of this text feels that, is that really free and open source software? Like free as in freedom? Can people do whatever they want with their licenses? Well, with their software. I think this is where I ended, right? While restricting usage of programs due to ideology. Nope. I don't think I read that bit. Legality of censorship. No. Where was I? Blocking users based on their service provider is censorship. Yeah, I think this is where I was, and I agree that it is censorship. Right, then we were talking about legality of censorship. Considerations. Yeah, from different definitions. They had a... I didn't agree with their total definition. They ran a little soft and loose with the term censorship. Right? They could, like, any banning is censorship. So there is no difference in this text between just banning or blocking and censorship. Any type of banning or blocking anything is always censorship. Actually, something that could be argued from this text is also, if I'm not able to do whatever I want with my software, and that is not freedom, they're saying as well. Yeah, exactly this here. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. My example was, yeah, I want to press enter and I want there to be world peace in my Firefox software here. That's how I wish to run the program, and that's my purpose. So I'm gonna press enter now. Did we get world peace? No. Then no. Firefox is not a free software. It's a non-free software, right? I know it's extreme, but it's the same logic. I do whatever I want? Okay. So legality of censorship. Maybe we did read this, I don't remember. Considerations. Programmers have copyright to their creations and are quite free to dictate how their code and applications can be used and by whom. That is how the law works at the moment, yeah. These rights can possibly be subject to preceding rights by others. Rights that create more compelling duties to respect other people's freedoms. Right, you cannot do... There are some laws that go over other laws, yeah. The creators can also willingly give away parts of these rights to others with contracts and agreements. That's not how it works in Sweden, no. We can have contracts and agreements, and some of the things can go against, but the law trumps any contract in Sweden, pretty much. You can't... I don't know how to exemplify that. Let's say, for example, that I get a job. We have a law about, I don't know, the 40-hour work week. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but let's say it's like that. I cannot write a contract for a 60-hour work week. Like, well, we can write a contract, but it's breaking the law, and we cannot opt out of that law. I cannot decide, like, that law is designed to protect me. I cannot decide to not be protected. So what we would have to do if I would want to work the 60-hour work week, we would contract the 40 hours and then I would work the rest illegally. If that were the case, yeah. In the case of open source, the creators of software code enter into a licensing agreement with others, guaranteeing their right for using and modifying the code freely. Husky is licensed under GPL 3, so the GPL license will be examined in more detail, though many of the findings might be applicable to other similar licenses. Yeah, right. My guess is it's not that the GPL is the GNU public license is what they want to change. Maybe it is. But my argument would be, yeah, create another license that is focused on not having any censorship within the software. Something interesting, like pragmatically thinking. Well, yeah, exactly, for the proliferation. That's what Node-Runner said, right? Because I was thinking the Tusky creators would not use that type of licensing, right? That says no censorshipping. They would not be using that type of license unless they used some software in them. Right? If they had something upstream, they had used some other free and open source software. Like, what if Mastodon had a licensing thing where censorship was not allowed? However, that is not how Mastodon runs things. Mastodon think it's great to do censorship. And I don't think... Yeah, Mastodon wouldn't work with that license now that I think of it. The whole point of it is that it's decentralized and you pick and choose who you want to read to. It's like following. But when you follow someone and don't get information from someone else, that would be considered censorship from the definition that we played around with. I don't think Mastodon would work with that kind of license, but that's just a quick thought. Right. Further considerations are any agreements entered in the distribution of applications. For example, in the case of Tusky, app publishers need to agree to the Google Play Developer Distribution Agreement and developer program policies, which require them to adhere to certain rules for distribution through the Google Play Store. Yeah. One could make an argument that even though Tusky were a little bit dickish about it, and right, they were kind of assholes against Gab when they did this thing with the rickrolling and whatnot, one could guess that it might not only be motivated as a censorship, right? It might not be Tusky who are the censors. Maybe it's the Google Play Store who are the censors. Because what I heard was that what they said in this text, I think, was that they made a fork of Tusky without all these censorship. But that Google banned that fork from the Google Play Store. Right. And then it would make even more sense, right, for Tusky to do this. I'm fine with Tusky doing this, by the way. Just reiterating that. I just wish this wasn't the motivation. Google Play Store. But well, actually, no, that's fine. If you want to be on the Google Play Store, then you do the Google Play thing. That makes sense. These agreements differ from platform to platform and might restrict app developers' rights in different ways when it comes to the distribution of compiled applications. And that is where it becomes weird, right? Restrict app developers' rights. I don't think it's restricting rights. What they're doing is restricting access to the Google Play Store. Right? Tusky can do whatever they want, but Google Play Store will not include them if they have access to the Gab. Is that a restriction of rights? I don't think so. It is censorship, definitely, but it's not a restriction of rights as it stands right now. Notably, these considerations do not relate to the open source code, but to the compiled executable application, which users download and run directly. Right, you have the source code, and then you have the binary, the actual program. When you get most programs, you don't get the source code bundled with it, unless it's a Python application. And some others, but usually they are not written like that. They are compiled. Right. Possible violations of the GNU Public License version 3. Definition of free. The definition of free software has been discussed since the 80s, with GNU's first bulletin being one of the first records of what is considered free software. Here we go. When we, the Free Software Foundation, speak of free software, we are referring to freedom, not price. Yeah, not like in free beer, but... This definition of free software focuses on user freedom, but mainly discusses the freedom to share, read, and modify code. Yeah, we were looking at that. It has to be open sourced. You have to have access to the source code so you can compile your own binary. You can make changes and create your own program from the source code. Yeah. Share, read, and modify, exactly. And you can just audit the code. That's what triggered this whole thing. This might have not been noticed if not for the people auditing the code, looking in the code. Well, of course they noticed, like all the Gab users got banned and they would have talked about it elsewhere. Open source initiative states that open source by definition should comply with no discrimination against persons or groups. Wait, are we discriminating? No, the Gab users still have access to the source code. They did fork it, right? Right, and no discrimination against fields of endeavor. Right. Users of a specific Mastodon instance constitute a distinct group, especially if instance selection is based on an ideology or other identifiable characteristic, which means that domain blocking doesn't comply with this criteria. That is unfortunate. That is not how discrimination works. Yeah. You don't get to define the group yourself, I'm pretty sure. I think discrimination. I think it's here we go. Race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation, as well as other categories. Right, we're not looking at race, gender, age, religion, or sexual orientation. Or ethnic background is, I think, one of them. We're not looking at any of those. So I would not consider this discrimination. And even if the Mastodon, the Gab users, you don't get to pick and choose your groups yourself, because that, well, even if that was the case, I don't consider this discrimination. Well, no, it's censorship. It's not discrimination, it's censorship. Like, it's still, like it says, the focus is on the software, right? And they still have access to the software. They have complete access. There is no discrimination. The Gab users are still allowed. They just don't get to use that instance, which is the Gab. The Gab instance is the thing that is not allowed. They can, like, any person can still use Tusky if they so choose, just through another instance. Any person also can get the source code and fork it and use one of those. Yeah, share and modify the code. So I feel that this is again a very long stretch. Right, that would be let's say well, not Firefox, let's say my terminal here. All right, my terminal is not voice activated, therefore my terminal over here is discriminating against all people who has no voice, who can't speak, well, who has no fingers and cannot type. Right, it's the same kind of fuzzy logic as before, where it doesn't work out, right? This cannot be discrimination, because if you take this to be discrimination, then everything is everything is discriminatory. It's the same kind of logic as before, as with the freedoms, right? There you go. The first freedom, the freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. It doesn't work. Right. Interestingly, this point of contention was at least partly already considered around the 90s by the GNU project, which added freedom 0 to their text, which precedes the freedoms relating to study, redistribution, and the modifying of the code. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose. Here it comes again. Yeah, exactly. And this doesn't work. It doesn't work. This is an attitude, not a rule, right? This is an attitude. As an attitude, I'm all for it, right? Let anyone to do whatever, right? But you cannot use it as an argument, as... Yeah, exactly. It precedes the freedoms. It's just... Yeah, it's a descriptive thing. This is the attitude we have. This is our aim. You can't, like, using it as a rule of law or a rule of the GNU GPL, it's a mistake because it doesn't lead anywhere useful. We cannot talk about it the way that this text talks about it. Because anyone can use this to argue for whatever they want, right? It's the same with this discrimination. If you're allowed to define what a group is, right? I can just bring a friend and say, we two are now a group and we are being discriminated against because reason X. It's the same thing. It does not work. It's not generalizable. Right. Stallman later expanded on the reasons why programs must not limit the freedom to run them by licensing explicitly, stating that distributions shouldn't restrict how you use the software. Yeah, that's a vague idea and it works. It's a vague idea. Oh, here we go. It is worse than ineffective. It is wrong too, because software developers should not exercise such power over what users do. But that's inherently what software developers do. Whoever decides, and here we go, right? It is a decision to use a piece of software. That piece of software might be following the Unix philosophy. Do one thing and do it well. If a user wants to do another thing, then the software developers is kind of, from this logic, the software developer is restricting them by not having the software being able to do everything. Right? The software is not capable of doing all the things, and therefore you could consider it restrictive. Right. Imagine selling pens with conditions about what you can write with them. This is the same argument as yesterday, but they said keyboards. That would be noisome, annoying, right? And we should not stand for it. That's an interesting point, though. Yeah, that is not, the Free Software Foundation should not stand for it and should be against that type of thing. But maybe the GPL, it is an argument for no censorship. It would make the GPL even more restrictive, right? I wonder how that... I hope there will be in the end of this article like an example of what wording could be added, because that I am curious about. To this attitude that they're portraying, how to implement that in a license. I don't know, but I'm curious to look what they have to say. Likewise, for general software, if you make something that is generally useful, like a pen, people will use it to write all sorts of things. Even horrible things, such as order to torture a dissident. But you must not have the power to control people's activities through their pens. It is the same for a text editor, compiler, or kernel. Yeah. Right, and that's kind of, yeah, the license would not work on Mastodon, because the Mastodon, how to interact with Mastodon, that should be for the users of Mastodon, right? They should have, the users of Mastodon should be able to censor whatever they want, right? They should be able to, oh, I don't want to see this. That's interesting though, because the users of Mastodon can do whatever they want. They can create Tusky, but the users of Tusky becomes weird. Right. Notably, Stallman was writing specifically about license restrictions. If the ideal of freedom is user choice, it is difficult to see how hard-coded limits would fit this ideal. Alright, the problem that ends up here that I have with this whole thing is that overall, with this restriction, right, all the implementations of instances of Mastodon would look the same, which would overall reduce the freedom of the users. Right? The users that do not want to see Gab would be forced to see Gab. No filtering, no censorship would be allowed. And then would be saying, alright, I'm gonna teach you how to read books, but now you have to read all the books, or worse, you need to read all the canon books. You need to have them and read them. Isn't that reduces freedom for the user? Becomes an interesting discussion of what freedom is. I understand why they have been at it since the 80s and probably still don't agree on what the freedoms are. Right. But when it comes to open source, the ideal is to secure users' freedom in the relation to the source code and not the distributed programs. Yeah, I think that's probably the approach that makes sense to me as well. Yeah, instead of focusing on like the use case and the binary, it would be better to just open source the source code and let people take it and do whatever they wish with it. That would be the best way to deal with this. Right, while not related to the license, it is worth noting that such distinction only secures freedoms for the people who have the necessary skills to alter code and compile the programs, discriminating against those who do not have the means to remove restrictions for themselves or cannot have others do it for them. Alright. This is not true. Yeah, here we go. Only secures freedom for the people who have the necessary skills. That is not true, right? I don't have the skill, but someone else can fork and distribute a non-censored version of Tusky, and I can download that. That is how software works. So that's just not true, right? It's like I completely reject that, and it's also I don't like the argument at all, because and if you run into the problem, right? If you take the end user, right? Who is the end user? The end user of Mastodon or the end user of Tusky? Because where you will end up in a situation where you can argue restricted freedoms. You cannot get out of it. So the best way is to just get access to the source code and do whatever you want with the source code. And that's not a discrimination. Let's say the ocean is discriminating against me because I cannot swim. Right, we cannot have a local pool because I cannot swim, and having a pool would be discriminating against me because I cannot swim. I can swim, but you get my point. It's the same logic. This is the this doesn't work. It doesn't work. Again, you're choosing your group. People who are not skilled at something cannot be a group. Because if that were the case, then nothing would be allowed to require skill to be used, because that any skill level would be a discrimination. Which means my stove, I couldn't cook any food because not everybody knows how to use a stove. What about my toddler niece? She doesn't know how to open doors, so that's discrimination against her. She cannot open doors, therefore doors are discriminatory. That's... I get why you end up in this situation. It's like you get blinded. The author of this text, they get blinded because they get too narrow-minded in their idea that the Gab users were treated like shit, and therefore they throw around words like freedoms and discriminations, but they only look at this specific example and don't try to generalize what they're saying. And that makes this whole thing just falls apart with just a little bit of scrutiny. That's unfortunate. While restricting the usage of programs due to ideologies arguably against the spirit of free software, akin to Stallman's above example of dictating what can be written using a pen, it is not against the licensing terms of the GPL. Yeah. Like you say, arguably, I disagree. Since what makes sense is to make the source code free. Yeah. Source code, not binaries. I really like that. It's too bad that it... Text...
I'm a leaf on the wind.
The text even conceded, right? They conceded that, well, it's mostly been focused on the source code. But then we move it to the binary. They want to move it towards the binary. But moving it to the binary, I think there is a reason why the focus is on the source code. It's because it doesn't work when it is about the binary. Right, when you're trying to license and tell the developer how their software is supposed to work, that's a problem, and that is where the text is going, right? Want to tell people how their software is supposed to be working. Tell the developer that's not a good idea. And that's why the open source focus is on the source code, because you can do whatever software you like and make it work however you see fit, as long as you give access to people to change it how it works. And if people don't have the skill, that's... I mean... it's just dumb, thinking that this skill necessary. I wonder how many people have the skill to make changes in Firefox. Let's say I wanted... I don't know. There's probably a lot of people. Let's say I didn't want block. I did not want ads in my Firefox. I don't have the skill to do that. Someone else does, though. They help me out. That's great stuff. Right. Stallman's explicit acceptance of DRM, as long as it can be removed, speaks to this directly. Yeah, exactly. Such software code is still open source, but the distributed software application is no longer free. What do they mean by that? It's no longer free? This distinction speaks volumes of the need for terms such as FOSS, free and open source software, that makes the distinction between free as in freedom and merely open source. That's not my understanding at all of the difference between free as in freedom and free as in merely open source. Right, let's say Tusky, since Tusky is the hunchbag in this whole text. Let's say Tusky decided to have DRM. Let's say they added a DRM thing that you had to pay them. Right? Let's say money here. You had to pay them like $5 to unlock the DRM and use the code. But the source is still published, so you could compile it yourself. Oh, actually, there are real examples of that. What's that called again? Fuck. Damn it. It's an itch game, similar to Factorio. Shapes. Like Shapes.io is like this. Right, where is it? Discord. This game is open source. Here you go. This game is open source. It is... You can go to GitHub. You can download it. And, right, you can also, right, you even have instructions on how to install it. How to compile it and create your own binary. And you can change all this code around. But... that's one way to get access to a binary. Another way to get access to a binary is Steam Shapes. Right here. Here it comes a binary pre-compiled, but here you pay for it. And this is kind of... One could say that Steam, in this case, is a way... DRM. Yeah, in this case, Steam acts as a digital rights management tool for this binary. This specific binary works through Steam. Maybe it works... If you download it, it might work without Steam, but for my example, let's pretend that it does need Steam to run. You have to have Steam installed and open to run the software. That's my understanding. And that can be free and open source software, and it's not merely open source because you are allowed to go into the source code, change it, and compile your own binary. Well, maybe you're not allowed to. Let's assume that is the case. I haven't looked into it, but let's assume that you're not allowed to distribute the binary, and that's part of the DRM thing. You're not allowed to publish or send or distribute a binary. You can still publish and fork it and have your own source code sent around. Exactly, as long as it can be removed, which it can in this example. And I would say that that is free and open source software. Free as in freedom. It's not merely open source. If it depends, right? It depends on what the licensing says. If the license says that you are not allowed to distribute the source code, then it is merely open source. You're not allowed to distribute the source code. Then it's not free as in freedom, because you cannot change it. And, well, you can change it, but you cannot distribute your changes. That's the difference, as I understand it. Alright, permission to run the program. Line 158 of the GPL3 license states, wait, 158 lines? I thought I had read the whole GPL. I guess I haven't. I thought it was way shorter than this. This license explicitly affirms your unlimited permission to run the unmodified program. Okay. The license goes on to prohibit different ways of limiting the use of software, including the use of DRM that cannot be removed, as well as withholding installation information. All right. This is dumb. Withholding installation information, what does that mean? Well, I can bet that there are two types of interpretations of this. Withholding installation information would be actively hiding stuff. Like having DRM in your open source code that we've got a hashed password that is needed to install this code. But how it can also be used could be considered withholding installation information. That would be, there is no guide in how to install this piece of, how to create this binary. There is no guide, and that could be considered withholding installation information, because it doesn't guide you from step to step how to install it. And I'm just gonna guess that is what this text is gonna be using, because that doesn't work as withholding. All right. Yeah, and like I said before, any Gab user can run this software, they just cannot use it in Gab. Any person can use this program. There is no discrimination happening. It has been argued that allowing the program to run in this manner is enough for freedom zero. Freedom zero. Only the functionality of the application is limited, not its... Sorry, I got sidetracked. It has been argued that allowing the program to run in this manner is enough for freedom zero, as only the functionality of the application is limited, and not its running, as blocking is done after the program starts. I didn't quite understand what in this manner. I don't quite understand what that means. Are they talking about Tusky again? While domain blocking technically allows the program to be run, it only does so similarly to a DRM system that runs only to disallow the usage of said program. No, I completely disagree with that. That doesn't work out for me. Well, as my understanding is, digital rights management systems stops the program from running. This doesn't stop the program from running, there is a function that does not exist in this program. There's a big difference. So I don't think the comparison between DRM or permission to run the program, it doesn't work, like, at all. Because any Gab user can run the program, it's just that they cannot go to Gab. They would have to go through the person itself can run the program. Right, some DRM systems require a login after the application runs, and block access if the login is not licensed to use the program. Exactly. Just like Tusky requires a login, and I cannot go to Tusky and log in with my, here we go, with my ProtonMail account. I cannot do that. Is that a DRM system? I disagree. I cannot log in with my Steam account. It would be disingenuous to claim that in either case the program runs DRM. It would be disingenuous to claim that in either case the program runs for DRM blocked users, when it fulfills none of its intended functions for non-licensed users. Alright. But what is the solution to this? If you don't want this to happen, then you cannot allow any login. It's not necessarily about the non-licensing users, it's about having a login that works. Having a login system is inherently restrictive. And arguing that, oh, they restricted through logins. That's an argument against logins, but without logins, how can you identify yourself? How can you be a user, right, in the space? How can you get followers or follow other people? I mean, follow other people you can do fine, but how can you get followed? Like, social media kind of, not all of it, but a lot of it is built around the idea that you have a persona or a login, a handle. You are someone. Still, even this type of DRM is explicitly allowed in the GPL3 licensed applications. As long as the users are free to change the source code and run their own versions of the program without such restriction, Freedom Zero is retained to those who can compile their own programs. Or have friends to compile it for them. Or not even friends, just there exists people who do this. Again, that's very ugly. That rhetorics. This rhetoric is just ugly. Because it doesn't make any sense. I know that I'm not saying that they are disingenuous or malicious or try to do fancy, ugly rhetorics. It's just that just didn't see it. Didn't have someone proofread this for them. While domain blocking is akin to DRM in that it blocks the program from working based on the used media, Mastodon instance or DVD respectively, this is not against the GPL. Yeah. Yeah, and having that being against the GPL would not work. Right, denial of access. GPL 3-line of evil states access to a network may be denied when the modification itself materially and adversely affects the operation of the network or violates the rules and protocols for communication across the network. this whole thing, this whole paragraph, this whole section is gonna be not working because they are not denying access to the network, because Tusky are not the people in control of Mastodon. Mastodon is decentralized. They cannot deny access to the network. Tusky just can't. It's not doable. Insofar as domain blocking can be construed as denying access to a network. Nope, it cannot. Such as deny rules usually affect network traffic and not user input that is expected to translate to network transfer. Domain blocking could be in a violation of the GPL. Nope. However, such interpretation of network access would be shaky at best. Yeah, it's not even shaky. You have no ground to stand on, and not the intended meaning of this part of the license. The line is noted here only for the completeness sake. Okay, sure. Yeah, just pointing out that this doesn't work. I would use harder. Use harder language and say that this is too friendly, shaky at best. No, it's worse than that. Right, interruption of service. It could be tenuously argued that censoring a Mastodon instance constitutes a disruption of service. Right, the developer agreement states, "You will not engage in any activity that interferes with, disrupts, damages, or access in any unauthorized manner to the devices, services, network, or other properties or services of any third party." However, the word disruption generally refers to larger disruptions to a network or a system, just as in the case of the GPL, and not to specific blocking of users' intended services. As such, domain blocking does not seem like a violation of this clause. Yeah, right, it doesn't interfere with the running of Gab or the running of any Mastodon instance. That is not what they're doing. One could argue that it removes stress on the Mastodon server even, which I would not argue that. Actually, no, it's just dumb. Right, product takedowns. Google's agreement prohibits product takedowns from users that have previously purchased or downloaded the products. This is a shaky argument, though, that can be made. You may remove your products from future distributions via Google Play at any time, but you agree to comply with the agreement and the payment processor's payment account terms of services. Prior to removal, including but not limited to refund requirements. Refund, but if it's free, purchased or downloaded. All right. Removing your products from future distribution via Google Play does not affect the rights of users who have previously purchased or downloaded your products. Remove your product. So that's interesting. With every update, you concede, you agree to the update, right? You download, it's considered being a new thing. Otherwise, Google would have to, there would have to be every version of the software have to be available for whoever has it. When you download a new version, having access to the previous version. Right. Remove your products from devices from any part of Google Play where previously purchased or downloaded applications are stored on behalf of users. Oh. Change your obligation to deliver or support products or services that have been previously purchased to download by users. That's interesting. Right, Gab users that used Tusky before domain blocking was implemented suddenly found themselves rickrolled instead of giving this service that they were using. Yeah. Dick move indeed. As modern phones often automatically install updates, good point, users might not have no way to prevent loss of service due to updates. Nope, it doesn't work. You could log in through another instance, right? You don't have to log in through Gab. You still have access to the service. It could be argued, but that's a bit shaky though, that argument. Since you're losing your own Gab account, right? You don't have access to your account anymore. Even though the account is not a service provided by Tusky. Service is provided by Gab, so it becomes muddy. It could be argued that blocking Gab users that had previously been able to use the app breaks this clause of the agreement. I could see that. It could be argued, but it's a bit shaky. But it could be argued, and I agree with that. From another point of view, the wording of the clause seems to only affect removals of complete applications and not removal of functionality. Yeah, exactly. But the removal of functionality becomes interesting in this, right? Because what is the point when you remove the application? You remove the functionality of the application. What makes an app? What makes a functionality? Interesting metaphysical ideas. However, if one considers functionality removal okay under the clause, this would allow to removal of any program by replacing it with a placeholder application with no functionality. Exactly. At least when it's done in a targeted manner. Without clarification from Google, the clause remains particularly unclear. Nevertheless, there seems to be grounds to argue that removing functionality from users who previously downloaded the application is a violation of this policy. I would agree. You could make that argument. I can also... But that's all up to Google to decide, right? That's a one cheeky way to get at them. Alright, deceptive behavior. GitHub user Vasref commented on Tusk's pull request, Tusky, that he needs to trust apps installed on their phone, and suggested that the app doing something against the will of the user is in violation of Google Play developer policy, which states that Google doesn't allow apps that attempt to deceive users or enable dishonest behavior. Rickrolling is inherently dishonest. And the app is rickrolling people. Good point, yeah. It's all a lot of Google policy stuff, and that's just an argument for it being removed from Google Play. And I'm fine with that, yeah. And I think that's a little bit... It's fighting fire with fire. Right, we saw the blocking of Gab was very rude. Emotional, whatever, and going this route and doing the same, just removing it from Google Play, that would just be to spite the Tusky developers, right? So I can see the argument and it makes sense. I mean, you could try to get it removed from Google Play just to spite the developers, but I personally would not. Even though I can see that you can do, right? It's, to paraphrase the dude, you're not wrong, you're just an asshole. Right. It's interesting as well, right? This is someone who's arguing for GPL, loves the GPL and argue for free and open source software, and they start looking at the Google developers policy, right? It feels out of the scope of the actual text. Like, what is the text about? How free is free and open source software? Google is not free and open source stuff. The Google Play Store is not free and open source software. So why are we talking about this? This is just spiteful. And I would say it's out of the scope. Right, apps must provide accurate disclosure of their functionality and should perform as reasonable expected by the user. I mean, you could even argue that this doesn't work because they have right? Accurate disclosure of their functionality. They have their GitHub or whatever, where all the functionality is described because it's an open source application, and any open source application, right? It is disclosed what the application do. Right? If the user expected something else, that's on the user, I would argue. Users can reasonably expect a service client to log in and function as a service client, so domain censoring in this way constitutes a policy violation. I disagree with that. I would probably say that, yeah, I don't think that's a policy violation. I think the sudden change, that would be deceptive, right? The sudden change could be considered deceptive. But it's wobbly ground. I don't know what the Google Play Store info for the update was, right? The patch notes for the update. Right, not disclosing such censorship functionalities, for example, the app description, constitutes a violation. Yeah, I completely disagree with that. Censorship functionalities, right? That type of censorship is built into Mastodon, so it's a feature of Mastodon. Do they have to explain how Mastodon works in the Tusky application? I don't think so. Right, Tusky's domain block could constitute as deceptive behavior if the user doesn't get any information of why, instead of logging in, they're now watching a video of Rick Astley from 87. Clear explanation of the blocking functionality and the descriptive error messages would alleviate this infringement. Yeah, it's like they're rickrolling people, and that's a dick move. But sometimes being a dick is funny, right? Should nobody ever be allowed to do a rickroll anymore in any software? Is that where we end up? Like all the software that do the April 1st jokes and whatever. But yeah, I can imagine someone who's never heard of rickrolling, never heard of anything of like this, and they just want to log into Gab and on their new phone, and they're looking for an app, and they find Tusky, and then they log in, and then they like, what is this video? What is happening? I don't understand. And that would be deceptive. Like, they would feel deceived. Alright, minimum functionality. Google's developer policy also requires the following. At minimum, why are we talking about Google's developers policy? Why are we talking about this? In this... Are we just... Okay. At minimum, apps should provide users with a basic degree of functionality and a respectful user experience. Apps that crash exhibit other behavior that is not consistent with a functional user experience, or that serve only to spam users. There we go, spam users, that's the rickrolling. Are not apps that expand that catalog in a meaningful way. Yeah, it's a minority of the users, but yeah. Logging into a service on an application whose only function is to work as a client to be used to services clearly violates this policy. I disagree. The rickrolling violates this policy. Not being able to log in does not. Like, I cannot log into this Tusky app. I can't do it with any of my logins. Therefore, furthermore, doing so by rickrolling isn't respectful and constitutes another clear violation. Yeah, that is the violation. Even with a respectful examination of the intended blocking functionality and the descriptive error message during the blocking, it is difficult to consider not logging in as providing a basic degree of functionality. I disagree. I completely disagree. That's... yeah, for the reasons I stated previously. Alright, conclusion. Domain blocking through rickrolling doesn't seem to be against the GNU public license. It is not, yeah. But it does arguably violate Google's developer Program policies. Sure, as it blocks the users from application's minimum functionality. No, it does not, but it does violate some of the policies. But if you scour the Google's developer program policies, you could find that like there is... I'm gonna pull stats from my ass here and say probably at least 50% of all the programs on the Google Play Store is violating these if you nitpick like this and you want to tear them down. Also, how is that relevant for this text, right? Google is proprietary bullshit. Alright. Furthermore, removing access from previous users seem also to violate Google Play Developer. Alright, it does. That I agree with. And what you could argue instead of doing this is just say that it's a dick move, which I don't think people would disagree with. I don't care about the Google's policies. I care a little bit about the GPL, but right. It's not against the GPL, but it is a dick move. Here we go. Rewrote it. I like it way better. Nevertheless, the clauses are unclear when it comes to blocking functionality in this way and require clarifications. Sure. And this is an argument about Google's policies, which are you kidding me? That's so out of scope. GPL allows for functionalities that limits users' rights.
Breathe. Just breathe.
I hate that word. Such as DRM, as long as such limitations can be removed from the source code by the users and the newly created program can be used without limitations. Yep, thus domain blocking as another way to limit usage rights digitally is allowed by the licensing terms, and programmers have not signed away their rights to decide how the applications they distribute will be used. Yeah, the binary application. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, that the developers decide how the binary should work. Who else should decide, right? Should we have like a top-down person standing with a whip deciding, no, software has to be using like this, right? Top-down rules, how your software is allowed to be used? That doesn't sound very free, does it? Though end users are free to change the source code and overrule any imposed limits. Exactly. However, distributed applications with such limitations can no longer be considered free, as they limit the freedom of users to use the program as they wish. Yeah, and this is dumb. It doesn't, well, it's not dumb, it's just, it doesn't work. My apologies for calling it dumb, it's just, I've not explored where this leads. This logic doesn't lead anywhere useful. This does create some inequalities between those who have the technology knowledge necessary to bypass these limitations and who do not. Any knowledge creates inequality. Any skill that I have and you don't have creates inequality between us, because I can do the thing and you cannot do the thing. That's how skill works. That's how knowledge works. However, such questions about the morality and unintended consequences of domain blocking would require a multidisciplinary ethical examination of the case, which is outside of the scope of this paper. Fucking lies! They said that they were gonna do an ethical examination, and they really haven't. Well, a little bit. But they spent more time on the Google policy than the ethical examination. Actually, I'm sorry, that's my bad. That was my reading, my understanding that we would have more ethics in the text, and I'm a little bit disappointed. That was just me expressing disappointment. So sure, it's out of the scope. It's just the stuff that I find interesting. Morality and unintended consequences. Right, we did talk about the Overton window, which is an interesting discussion to have. The morality about the thing? Yeah, it's a dick move. Well, I would say it's an etiquette. I don't take any moral issue with what Tusky did. except for like Overton Windows stuff in the grand scheme of things, like ethical structures, long-term changes to society. That I see as interesting, but short-term morality in current context, I don't have any problem with it. Etiquette-wise, though, it was a dick move. Alright, even though domain blocking doesn't seem to violate GPL, blocking all application functionality by rickrolling them based on users' selected communication group or ideology does seem at odds with the general ideology of free software. I disagree. And distributing such censorship functionality in software should be done carefully, with transparency and respect. With transparency. I don't know about carefully and respect. I mean, I would go the respect route, but transparency over the, like, way more important than the other one. Right, to do otherwise seems to be against the Google developers' distribution agreement. There might be similar clauses in other platforms' distribution agreements. Implementing domain blocking under GPL creates software that is open source and non-free. I disagree. Which is an interesting space to inhabit, especially when it comes to questions of free speech and censorship. The ethical consideration of such cases clearly require more research. Yeah, that's not my understanding of non-free at all. That's we having a different understanding. Free speech and censorship is not part of the GPL, is it? You don't have to have free speech. And it would be weird to enforce free speech in software. Yeah, it would get weird, because that would be top down. Actually, I have argued for that before, but I would not do that in a license. Right. Since we're talking about it being top-down and free speech, like I said before, my conclusion is that this is not a... And I'm actually a little bit sad about that. They didn't give any example of how they could change a licensing. Right. How they could create a license to achieve what they want to achieve. No censorship. That's super disappointing. But my thinking is that if that is something politically that we want, I would not go the route through licensing software, telling people how to make their software. No, I would make that a political regulation thing about free speech, that's saying that people who write stuff on the internet are considered the publishers. If I write something on Mastodon or Twitter, then I am the publisher. Not Twitter, not Mastodon. At the moment, Twitter is considered the publisher, so they have free reign, just like Mastodon have free reign. And I think that even with those changes, right, having the more free speech, less censorship in the world, I think Tusky, it's still fine for me to Tusky to do this. Yeah, definitely. Because it's their piece of software, and they should be free to create that piece of software how they see fit, and the license should encourage them to create whatever piece of software they want to use and any functionality they want to have. And if I want to change the functionality, I should be able to. Alright, so there were some big leaps of logic that didn't work out for me. But it was interesting to explore this. I say it is very free and open source. Still, the clients, they can do whatever they want. It's actually, I'm actually a little bit surprised. I thought I was gonna read this and be more... But I started out thinking that it's fine if Tusky want to do this. And I thought I would shift the other way, but I feel like I've changed more strongly that it's fine for Tusky to do this. As long as it's done in the open, and people can fork it if they so choose. Ah. Alright. That was that.